I never understand those people who talk about, I have no regrets. I have no regrets. What's it? Usually American. And you think, how could you live your life without regrets? It means you've done nothing. You've made no mistakes.
You can't possibly live a virtuous life without making mistakes.
I don't think so.
It's within the errors that you find the growth and the learning.
Sure.
If you don't make mistakes, you don't know where you can improve.
Exactly.
And I think that could act as quite an interesting segue to get into the bulk of today's topic. But we're going to first of all, we're going to stop off at your acting career so that we can lay some foreground of...
I don't call it a career unless it's the verb.
Go on.
To career off a mountainside. It seems to me a series of lucky breaks that occasionally allow me to pay my electricity bill. Anything beyond that, I don't see it like, you do a job and that's a stepping stone to the next job. It's never been like that for me, at all. So I always think of it as the verb, to career off, rather than the noun.
But it has careered you off into some very interesting roles.
It has, yes, but by just sheer good fortune, just by luck.
Do you think that?
Yes, absolutely.
Why?
Well, I think that's what it is. It's you're a strolling player. I'm a jobbing actor, always have been, and you're always looking for the next job. And occasionally you wait and wait and wait, and you think it's not going to come, and then some fate intervenes. It's a life entirely built on sand and fate and requiring luck, which is a strange way to live your life, really is. But that's the only one I know, And occasionally I think to myself, well, what else could I do other than be a child and play? And the best thing I ever heard about it, acting, it's not really acting, it's reacting to somebody or something or set of circumstance. The best description I ever heard, and my little girl, Aniela, when she was going to preschool, they said one morning, now, today we're going to talk about what our daddies do for a living. And she didn't quite understand that. And she said, well, my daddy sits on the sofa and watches films. Old films in black and white, made in the Victorian age, And they said, no, what Daddy does for his work. So she looked confused at that and batted her eyelids. And she said, my daddy dresses up and asses around. And she was 4. And I've told colleagues that, and they go, I don't know a better description of it. I'm going to put that on my passport.
Yeah, that's a wise way of putting it.
It is, out of the mouths of babes.
That's the wisdom of the 4-year-old.
Sure. I think she got the asses around bit off me. She must have overheard me. Mea culpa.
Yeah. Right, well, in which case, I think an interesting point that we could broach into, as I said to you off camera, the substance of today's talk I'd like to take in the direction of the Holocaust. I think that would be a very interesting place to go, and there are a number of threads that we can broach here that will put this together. But in order to get there, I'd like to home in on your recent role as Churchill and your role as FDR as well, because I think these are touching the same fields in an interesting way and sort of lay that foreground nicely.
Yes, sure. I mean, I'm no expert, but I've read a lot about it and I've been fascinated by it for a long, long time. Perhaps it might be interesting to say how it became a subject.
Yeah.
Because my daughter's reading The Diary of Anna Frank, and I read it years ago, but I'm astonished at the humility, the humanity of this little girl, and fearless occasionally, and growing up, and it moved me incredibly. And Anna's become a great hero to my daughter. So when I promised her when she finishes the book, I'm going to take her to the annex where the diary was written, where she was hid before they were taken to Westerbork and then Auschwitz and then Belsen, and where she had the most ignoble and horrendous end you could possibly imagine, eating grass because she was so hungry. And yes, that character just amazes me. And, she achieved her ambition. She wanted to write, and she became a world famous writer. And what happened to her happened to so many. They say 1 million of the 6 million were children. That astonishes me. So I was saying to Nella, she asked me how I became interested in it. And I had a wonderful teacher at music school And I think it must have been the 40th anniversary of the liberation of Belsen. And, you know, there's that awful footage of the trucks and the British arriving and being horrified by what they saw. I mean, soldiers killed themselves because of what they'd witnessed. And the walking skeletons, and then burying the corpses, thousands and thousands of corpses. And that was shot by Richard Dimbleby, David Dimbleby's father. And he broadcast from Belsen to let the world know of the horrors. And so on the 40th anniversary, so I would have been, about 10. And Miss Lancashire said, you have to watch this, you have to see this. And showed us the footage, and we were all horrified. So that was the first indelible image of it, like for so many people who were born long after the war. And then I had a professor who was Polish, and there were lots of myths and legends about him. He was rather famous in Poland. And apparently he'd escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto right at the time that Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec were starting to claim victims daily as they were clearing the ghetto. Apparently he escaped by the sewers. That was the story, whether it's true or not, but he survived. And I think he was the only one who survived. And that story, you know, I started studying with him when I was about 12 or 13. He was quite a monstrous man, really. I mean, his tragedy was writ large on his face. He used to scream at me. And, you know, I studied as a pianist, and he was this, you know, master pianist. And he'd play, you know, I'd play 2 chords in a lesson, and he'd just, no! And he'd scream, and they'd throw me out the room, and then the music would be thrown after me. All my music's cut to ribbons. And one day, I bought Martin Gilbert's The Holocaust, the Jewish Tragedy. And I couldn't put it down. I read that because trying to know what kind of life he'd had, and, you know, and I was shocked. There was Kaufman, the Labour politician, had been quoted on the back of the book, "One reads this book with bleeding eyes." I remember that. And I go back to it often, rather like Landsman's Shoah, the extraordinary documentary he made.
We're going to go there.
Within living memory, yes. So that's really how I got into it. And I think the reason I've studied it and kept reading it and kept being fascinated by it is that I find it utterly, utterly incomprehensible. The cynicism. You know, come on, ladies, come on, the water's getting cold. You know, where they'd been stripped of everything. They were there naked, they were stripped of their hair, and they were freezing, so, you know, in the winter, stuck to the ground, waiting for the gas chambers to be free. And then somebody on the roof going, "Alles schlaft," all asleep. Just horrifies me, absolutely. And then you start thinking of the amount of people who knew about it. So I met a German. I was playing in Germany, and an old man, and he said we had to close our shutters as they were taken, you know, and it wasn't spoken of, you know. So this basic freedom that we're enjoying now, being able to talk about anything, who knows how long that will last, but, you know, you can imagine you couldn't possibly talk about it. You know, and you had to turn away, and then you were co-responsible. Then you became co-responsible, implicit in the crime. And it does, yes, there's so much philosophy with it, but that's why I'm so fascinated with it, because it's incomprehensible. And I fear that history goes around in cycles. And I remember going to Auschwitz, actually not knowing what it was, because I was playing in a place called Oswiecim, I think that's how it's pronounced. And of course in German that's Auschwitz. You know, so, you have to go and see the camp, and suddenly I'm there. Extraordinary. That was a shock to the system, because I didn't know it was that. You know.
What did you think it was?
Oswiecim, a bustling town with a very busy railway. and people going about their business. And 2 miles up the road, the greatest death factory that ever existed.
Unfortunately, a very busy railway.
And I remember saying, I don't know of any, I've never read about a camp in Auschwitz, but the driver said, no, it's what it is in German, Auschwitz. And then Birkenau is further away from Auschwitz. It was a huge complex, but the amount of people that knew about it, extraordinary.
It does interest me, actually, a point you just touched on there of that sort of, if someone's to turn a blind eye and sort of pretend that what they're seeing is not what they're seeing, that you feel there's a level of responsibility there. Yes,
it's interesting that one of the quotes that I saw in Auschwitz was, forgive me, I've forgotten the philosopher, might have been Schopenhauer or something like that, but it was, if you do not see and understand what happened here, I'm paraphrasing, you will be responsible for allowing it to happen again. And that made a huge impression on me. And now, when you look at war and you hear of war and the Israeli-Gaza conflict that's been going on for thousands of years, Russia and Ukraine, all war, you try and understand, and you kind of are forced into picking a side, but it's just slaughter and it's horrific.
Yeah.
But that's,
I think there's a quote that I'm very fond of on this point, of those that don't study history are doomed to repeat it.
That's very good.
And I think that's right. I think you're actually seeing quite a significant resurgence of the same, just to sort of tie in two points here of the Israeli conflict and the Holocaust. This sort of anti-Semitism is coming to the forefront of society again, I feel. I think Twitter is a tremendous sort of vehicle for that.
It's ingrained in human nature. I mean, when you think the Polish Jews particularly, there was 1,000 years of culture and all forms of life, but the resentment was from the success, the civilization that they built. I remember going to Israel and being told by the old taxi driver, I've told you this before, but it's always worth repeating. He said, this, you see as far as the eye can see, what do you see? And I said, well, lemon groves and orange groves, and it was beautiful, pastoral, absolute thing of beauty, the colors, extraordinary. And he said, this was desert for thousands of years, desert. He said, we, the Jews, we made the desert bloom. And I thought, what an incredible remark that is. But it had been desert, and they'd made something of it, and they sell their oranges, lemons all over the world. Very successful.
Yes, very successful and loathed as a result.
Well, yes, of course. Envy is a sin, but it's one of the so ingrained in human nature that you can't get past it.
Yes, and
it's a ridiculous emotion, isn't it? Like bitterness, or like jealousy. Jealousy and envy. It's an empty emotion. It doesn't do anything apart from hurt the self. But then it can hurt others. We see how it.
You're totally right, though. They are absolutely useless emotions. There are other feelings that, though potentially negative toward the self or toward others, serve a purpose, but jealousy and envy are not. Do not fall within that category. The only purpose that jealousy seems to serve is just further destruction.
Absolutely. Well, the famous joke about how many actors does it take to change a light bulb? 1, and 100 to say, I could have done that better.
Are you the 1 or the 100?
I don't know. I used to be the 1 or one of the 100. I don't know anymore.
I do like a point, actually, that you made of the sort of the horror of war on both sides of that, because I do think that's an important point of, I know, of course, this is not applicable towards the topic of the Holocaust, because that was just total evil on the side of one, and persecution.
And it wasn't banal.
Yeah, go into that, because that quote is...
Hannah Arendt.
Yeah.
Yes. I was always uncomfortable with that quote. I think she wrote it in Eichmann in Jerusalem. This normal, nondescript man, like Himmler being a chicken farmer.
Yeah.
This nondescript man, and suddenly has the power. You put him in a uniform that is designed to terrify by boss. Yes? Yeah. Absolutely designed for that purpose of making you cower. I remember walking onto a stage once wearing the full SS uniform. And the director said to me after a while, he said, "For goodness sake, Christian," he said, "you're milking your entrance, aren't you, a bit?" And I said, "Watch the audience." And they cowered. And all I did was just walk, very slowly, milking it away,
But you're right, though. There is, the iconography of Nazi Germany in general is it is daunting, and it's so royal and prestigious, and this is a point of contention that I have found with a number of people, is where people say, "I don't understand how the Nazi or Germany became Nazi Germany." I said,
they voted them in.
Yeah, and it's not difficult to actually, controversial as it may sound, it's not difficult to understand why they did. Everything was set up in such a way that the allure of Hitler's regime was so prevalent, and you can see that to the finest detail of the buttons on the suits. It is
Gott mit uns.
Yeah, God
is with us.
With us.
Yeah, extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah. Have you looked into whether, just on that point, Hitler was sort of using that for an advantage towards appealing to the masses, or whether he was actually religious himself?
Well, I'm not too sure he was particularly religious. He was brought up in a Catholic society, and of course he did listen to the Bishop of Munster, didn't he? Who stood up in his pulpit and decried euthanasia. Hitler stopped it immediately. The same bishop was still in his pulpit in 1945 with the church around his ears and the country destroyed, still praising the Führer's birthday. Shortly before he blew his head off.
Yeah.
Hope it hurt. But never once stood up and talked about the fact that the Jewish brethren had been removed from Munster. Never said a word about that. Pius, the Vatican, massacre in Rome and all that. They never spoke about it. Hudal got Eichmann away. Bishop Hudal. Alois, I think his name was. Bishop Alois Hudal, who worked in Rome, gave them Red Cross passports to get them away to South America. Eichmann, Mengele, Stangl, quite a few, and many that we don't know of. Because even the Germans tried to. They all the Operation Reinhardt personnel were taken to Trieste fighting the partisans, where Himmler and the SS thought, well, they'll get killed by the partisans. Many did. Globlochnik was killed. Wirth was killed. That solves the problem. They're buried with full military honors. These monsters. They were trying to get rid of them. And Stangl, Franz Stangl, who was the commandant of Treblinka, he was under no illusion that they were being got rid of, in the same way that they got rid of the Sonderkommando. They liquidated anybody who survived to the end when they were closing the camps down.
Who's the Sonderkommando? I was looking when I was researching yesterday. That came up. I didn't actually look into it.
The Sonderkommando were the Jewish prisoners who were forced to survive another day, to pick up the corpses, take the corpses out of the gas chambers and burn them. And there's some incredible characters that survived. There's one man called Philipp Müller, who's interviewed in Shoah. Extraordinary man. And he survived 5 Sonderkommando liquidations and then was put on a death march. Any Sonderkommando? No, it didn't say it. And he survived. But that man was a Sonderkommando for like 3 years or something in Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. And I think he tells the story in Shoah, once he'd had enough. They'd do things like they'd see people from their town, and he went into the gas chamber with them. He said, "I've had enough." And they turned around and said, no, you have to bear witness. You have a chance to survive, however thin. I mean, it was no chance at all, but he did. He did. It's an extraordinary man. Some of those characters that did, you know, like of the 67 that survived Treblinka, there's a man called Richard Glaser. Extraordinary man. He bore witness. He stood in the dock and said, he did this, he did that, this. Monsters. People like Kurt Franz, you know, who murdered just in a bestial fashion. I mean, absolute monster. A cook before the war, given a uniform, programmed. A cook after the war. 65. I did nothing. I tried to help those poor people. But 67 of them said, no, you didn't. You murdered and murdered and murdered. You know, he would just take out a gun, a shotgun, and shoot somebody in the backside to see how long it took. Oh, just horrific, horrific. The stories are just very, very painful. And then, we'd got off we were going to talk about the banality of evil. Well, where it becomes banal is that ultimately it becomes a job, and you get used to anything.
Yes.
And they got used to 15,000 people a day. But Sukamel said, but we were up night and day. We had to work through the night. Poor sod, you know. But, you know, very primitive but efficient factory of death.
I think that's part of where the banality comes.
That's banal.
Yeah, that's that total sort of systemic approach to something that should not be at all systemic. I mean, the comprehension to you and
but you wouldn't be able to do it without.
Exactly. Well, that's what happens with the Iron grouping, wasn't it? Is they had moved.
All doctors, by the way. Every one of the commanders were doctors.
Really?
One of them was medical and philosophy. He was doctor. And working out how to save bullets by shooting a mother and child with one bullet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. These normal, ordinary men. There's a great book by Christopher Browning, the American historian, called Ordinary Men. These people from Hamburg, and they were butchers, and, well, they were butchers. I don't mean that in a comical sense. Greengrocers, postmen, pub landlords. And they were taken to Poland, and, tomorrow you've got to shoot 1,500 people, men, women, and children. I think 9 stood out. 9 said, I can't do that. 600 did it. And some of them got so used to it, they started to enjoy their work.
Have you looked into the rape of Nanking?
No.
The rape of Nanking was where the Japanese imperial force marched through China and stopped off in Nanking, and they subjected the people of Nanking to all forms of torture, rape, murder, and there's a prevalent theme there of people. They would throw babies into the air and see who could cut them in half with katanas. They made fun out of the most wicked of nature, and that is a consistent theme.
Bestial.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's. I think evil as a subject is going to be a big part of this conversation, but I think the thing that I think you and I share here of sort of not being able to wrap your head around how your mind could ever get to a place where you think, I'm going to throw that baby in the air and see whether I can cut it in half. You and I, from the comfort of these chairs, cannot understand that perspective. Now, there is a lot of nuance to the point, because there just is. It's the nature of the point of where someone's come from, what they've been taught. I mean, the Japanese were notorious for being horrendously racist to everyone but the Japanese.
The British.
Yeah,
you know.
I mean,
there's no difference between the the skeletons, walking skeletons at Belsen, and in the Japanese concentration camp.
Yes, they were wicked.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's the thing that I find hard to come to terms with, is how that becomes that banal, just standard procedure. But a question that I'd like to sort of broach as to get into that point is, do you think that all of the people who worked somewhere sort of, for instance, worked within the regime of Nazi Germany, or more specifically the SS, do you think everyone in that group could be constituted as evil?
No.
Why?
Because there are examples, rare examples, of humanity. Wasn't there a guard at Auschwitz who actually fell in love with a Jewish prisoner?
It wouldn't surprise me.
In Canada.
Yeah, that would.
There's all kinds of different differences. There were Otto Horn in Treblinka, who worked in the Totenlager, the death camp, in the gas chambers. The few that survived bore witness that he was a good man. You know, that he didn't mistreat the prisoners. He was doing a job. So I think he was found not guilty. And then there were people like Kurt Franz, or Auguste Mitier. I'm mispronouncing that. Miete, perhaps. Miete. Monsters. And actually actively enjoyed their power over their power to murder and kill and all kinds of horrors, commit all kinds of horrors. And then you have the commandant, who fascinates me because he was the only one who spoke about it, quite honestly. So much so that his last interview, 12 hours later, he was dead, where he admitted that he should never have left that place. His life should have ended there. And in that moment, he caught a glimpse of the man he could have been. But the question is that I've had to ask myself. Globlochnik turned around in Lublin, and when he tried to get out of it and say, because he was originally at Sobibor, they didn't tell him what it was. And then he found the gas chamber and said, this is like at Hartheim, where he'd worked in the euthanasia program. He was a policeman, a provincial policeman. And then he was taken to Treblinka. And Globlochnik named his 3 daughters as he was asking to be transferred to the Russian front, and said to him, I'm not making excuses for him, this is why it's so fascinating, this particular character, that all he had to do was make the trains run on time, the next 20 wagons. And he had to do it, it's a terrible thing to say, decently. It had to be efficient. Yeah. And with that wonderful German, he was Austrian, but that wonderful Anschluss efficiency, he made the trains run on time. He became efficient. And whatever happened, he turned a blind eye to that. He took a bottle of brandy to bed at night. Now, that's conscience.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. But they said he wore a white tunic. And they called him Der Weißen Tod, the White Death. It's a horrible, like Kurt Franz was Lalka, which is the doll, because he was a handsome man, preening in his uniform, kill him, that sort of thing. Lalka. And Stangl, he made it efficient, and the prisoners said, the survivors said, I didn't see him lay a hand on a prisoner. And he testified, I never touched anybody. And then he said, in a monotone, they became cargo. I didn't look at them as human beings. There was just a mass of flesh. And he would, and of course he wore the white uniform to keep the flies away, because the place stank. You could smell it for miles and miles around, especially when they started cremating the bodies. You see in Shoah, the farmers, they were tending their land right up to the gate. Of course, if they looked too closely, the Ukrainians would shoot at them. Ukrainians.
Let's touch on.
It's a huge subject, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm trying to be specific, and that's a very interesting point we made, and then went on to something else. Yes, it was banal to them. Killing became banal to them. That's perhaps what she means. I didn't think perhaps of
that. I would wage as much.
Because that's one point. But banality of evil, I'm uncomfortable with the phrase, because evil is rarely banal. So it's two different perspectives. If you're there and you become used to shooting somebody, because you've done it 1,000 times, You know, you performed a play 100 times. I've done it, you know, in front of 1,000 people and in the West End, and suddenly I'm thinking, I wonder what I'm going to have for dinner. And you're in the middle of, it becomes automatic.
Yeah, where to, at
Very
one point,
unprofessional, that, for me to admit.
At one point, you would have been potentially a bag of nerves, or I certainly would have been, and eventually, as you say, you get to that point where it is just second nature.
Well, let me segue to be a bit lighter for a moment. There's a great story that Kenneth Williams used to tell. He was doing St. Joan, and this drying happened to an old boy called Frank Royd playing the Archbishop in St. Joan, and he was supposed to say to Joan before she's taken to the flames, "You're utterly alone with your own impiety, your own ignorance, your own self-willed pride." Like this, and of course the scene depends upon the furore created by this speech. Then Joan says, "If I'm to go to the fire, then God will have all that." And one afternoon he's boiling in this cloth of gold and mitre and cassock and everything. And he goes, "You're completely dry." So he goes, you're on your own, you are. And they've all told you you're, oh dear, what is it? And he went in front of the audience. He went, bear with us, very difficult play. And got the script and said, "Oh yeah, you're on your own, you're on your own." Why I segued into that, I just thought, it just came into my head, in this kind of Joycean stream of consciousness that we were going. That, by the way, was a huge point of the camps. Black humour.
Really?
Yes. There was Stangl tells a story of a concert party being put on. They had to sing songs. There's a Treblinka song, we are one with Treblinka and marching and all this rubbish. And there was a comedian from Warsaw. And he opened an imaginary paper and said, this summer, come and get your vacation, Treblinka Health Spa. And all the Germans were laughing. Stangl wasn't laughing. And he was seen to be tapping his riding crop because he saw the satire that was going on, very, very black, But that's the only way they could. That's the only way they could cope with it. All these attempts at humanity. Because you think you're stuck there and you are, taking clothes apart and finding diamonds and jewellery and banknotes and, all the possessions, were hidden in their clothes, and that's all they had. I'm going
to make a point out of that sticks in line with this scatterbrain sort of effect. Have you seen? But are you aware of what Switzerland's involvement in the sort of riches that were found within the concentration camps?
Well, I knew that many rich Jewish people deposited their life savings or their wealth in Switzerland, as they do to this day. And I'm aware that it took 60, 70 years before Switzerland paid. Of course, then those people were taken.
Yeah.
It's like the famous Schindler. His business was started entirely with Jewish funds. He didn't have any money. They were his backers, and then they were destroyed, slaughtered.
Yeah.
So only to that degree.
See, I found this out yesterday. I thought it was very interesting whilst I was looking into the notes for today, that Switzerland were nowhere near as impartial as people think they were. For the assumption, when you look at the Axis versus the Allies, is that Switzerland fell in the middle and essentially just didn't want to know what was... They were a part of neither. They actually funded and received funds from both sides in tremendous amounts, and they were... happy recipients of some of the wealth that was taken from the concentration camps. Essentially, they were... I'm not well read on this enough to work out why they were such a sort of big mover behind the scenes, but they were. And I thought that was very...
Well, they're famous for their banks, aren't they?
That must be why.
Not their cuckoo clocks, but their banks.
That must be why.
Yes. To this day, Geneva is a huge financial centre, but there was no. It took years and years before the descendants of the people who were killed got a proportion of the money that was deposited back. That was obfuscated for decades, which is morally indefensible. But yes, I mean, it was tremendous corruption everywhere. I mean, that's a point Lanzmann makes in Shoah, when he says, oh, these are very nice doors. And this old couple there, and he said, oh, yes, the Jews did that. Oh, this was a Jewish house. All these houses were Jewish. Oh, right, and how come you're living here? So, well, they went, so we're living here. And do you miss them? Well, yes, perhaps. And it's the truth. They're being truthful. It's that anti-Semitism is ingrained. They show, don't they? They show a beautiful synagogue that's a furniture store. Oh, but we haven't desecrated it. All the art is still in there, But we use it as a furniture warehouse now. Well, they don't need it. They're not here. All that. Yes, it was right the way through society, right the way through society.
I've got 2 points. I think let's cover, first of all, for those that don't know, what Shoah is. And once we've gone through that, I've got a question that I think is going to have quite a lot of charge to it. But first of all, what is Shoah?
Well, Shoah is, they'll be given an everlasting name. It's the Hebrew version. Holocaust is, as I understand it, is kind of like destruction by fire. So as a word for the catastrophe, I prefer Shoah. It's their own word. And this remarkable French journalist, filmmaker, documentarian, a remarkable man called Claude Lanzmann, he decided to visit Treblinka, and suddenly it had an extraordinary effect on him, and he realized that this is where he had to make his film. He had to talk to the engine driver. And you see this old man, excited. He's not driven an engine for years, but he was the man who, for an entire year, pushed the wagons in, because the station is about 4 kilometers outside of the camp. So there's a siding, and the siding you can still see. The railway tracks are not there anymore, but you can see it. And he pushed them into the camp and took the empty wagons away. And there's an extraordinary part of the film where he arrives at Treblinka station, which is long gone now. And this old man with all this history in his face, and he just goes, nothing he could do. They gave him extra vodka. And the station master, the Germans are so efficient, they used to write the numbers of each wagon. And the station master, for over a year, took the numbers down. They're far higher than the 900,000. It's something like 1.2, 1.3 million. Whose figures are right? The man who was there, who saw it, who took the numbers on the wagons, or, posthumously records and that sort of thing. It's like when the deniers say, oh, it never happened, it was a transit camp. Just simply say, where did those people go?
Yes, Mr. David Irving, where did those people go?
Well, tell me about Shmuel Willenberg. Tell me about him. Where did he go? Where did his Ita and Tamara, his sisters, where did they go? And he was sorting the clothes one day, and he saw the dress, and he saw where his mother had repaired the dress. Alles schlaft, all asleep. And he had to come to terms with that. He was the last man alive from Treblinka. We don't know about Ukrainian guards, perhaps, I don't know, somewhere in Ukraine there's an old man who sees them in his dreams and was responsible. I don't know. The very, very ordinary people were put in those positions of power because they didn't question.
Well, and in many respects, who isn't an ordinary person? I don't think there are many people who are cut out from birth to be the person who's comfortable with overseeing millions of people's demise.
Yes, but the point Gita Sarini makes, who's a remarkable journalist, and she was entirely about trying to find the conscience in Stangl. The responsibility, because they all gave the same response. I was following orders. I was not responsible. I was following orders, which has a ring of truth. That if you think of the dictatorship, Hitler like a snake, if you step on its tail, it will come and get you, like they said to Stangl. Now I had to ask myself, could I seriously, in all conscience, have organized the trains, knowing that my beautiful Max and Agnella were at risk? If you don't follow government policy, you too will be in a concentration camp. That's the question. Thankfully, I don't have to answer.
Yes,
because I've never been put in that what was an extraordinary position.
Me and my dad were talking about this yesterday. It's a very interesting point. He said, on the point of sort of the evil at play within these regimes, he said, do you think anyone of any age, say for instance you were to now capture someone who was 100 who was responsible for some of these crimes, do you think that they should be tried for what it is that they've done? And I said that it's a very nuanced scene, because I would wage on my behalf that if someone was put in a position, which a lot of them were, where you say, you're going to do this, and if you don't do it, you're going in that camp, and your company will be your son, your brother, your mum, your dad.
The entire family, yeah.
Your entire family will go in there.
Yeah.
And when I know that context, I think how, in a totally unfair scene, how unfair would it be to say to someone, you should be put to death for something that you had no choice over, or well,
the immutable characteristic, a man cannot help what he's born as.
It is, our genetic hardwiring is precisely for the sake of preservation,
yes,
and particularly preservation of our family. And with that in mind, you think that's where I do touch base and understand how everyone. Jordan Peterson's got a great point of this, he has a sort of embedded fear within himself when he looks into the horrors of history, because he knows that he's capable of it, because a man was capable of it. Now, with the appropriate caveats of, if you're not a psychopath, you will be hard pressed to act the way that a psychopath acts, or a criminal psychopath, I should phrase. Without that in play, given the fact the rate of psychopathy in the world is very low in equation to how many people there are on the earth. A lot of the evil that is done in the world is not at the hands of someone with a mental disorder. It is at the hands of someone acting on emotion or order, or
in that moment.
Yeah, in that moment.
Terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think I'm not sure how I feel about that. The idea that I am capable of that level of evil, because I don't distrust that sentiment. I do think if you were to say to me, you're going to do what I tell you to do, otherwise you're really going to pay for it, I don't think I would be able to oppose that, and I don't think many people would be able to oppose it.
Well, there's a line in the great poem of the Four Quartets of T.S. Eliot, and he says, the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. And for years I didn't understand that line. There's a wonderful expression of Dylan Thomas where he says, I'd rather be what I was, arrogant and lost, than what I am, humble and found. It's almost like it's needed, that, certainly in a performing sense. But yeah, I mean, I think there's the absence, the total, utter absence of humility. And they chose people, perhaps on those lines, in order to program them more easily, manipulate them more easily, get them to do what was asked. But then responsibility, I don't know how that is possible. You know.
Well, it was shared responsibility, wasn't it? That was the sort of the idea.
Yeah, well, they hid behind that, didn't they?
Yeah.
And yet there are examples of, somebody like Otto Horn.
Who was Otto Horn?
Otto Horn worked in the gas chambers, but he was exonerated by the prisoners. Stangl, in a sense, I mean, he was in charge of it all, but he had nothing to do with it. He drank himself silly every night and just kept away. When the uprising happened, he was absolutely drunk as a skunk, and he didn't know what was going on. It was incomprehensible to him. He spent all his time organising the living quarters and making lovely streets, having the Jewish labourers, make beautiful streets and beautifying the place. That was how he coped. It's very difficult to empathise in any way with these positions at all, or to see any humanity in it. Going back to the point, I remember Oscar Gröning, that was his name, and he spoke to the BBC, The Nazis: A Warning from History, that programme, beautifully narrated, and he said, I'm speaking out because I was there, and his job was to collect the money, and there was a lot of money, all different currencies. That was his job. And somebody said to him, would you like to come and see the special action? Oh, well, I'll go and see it. And he was horrified, absolutely horrified when he saw it, as any human being would be. But he took no part in the killings. Absolutely. And at 96, they dragged him out. And he said, I'm saying this to bear witness, to counteract these Holocaust deniers who said it didn't happen. Well, I was there, and I was amongst the perpetrators. So he took a kind of moral responsibility for that, but then they put him on trial at 96. And it's like, well, what are you going to do? You're going to put a cook on trial because he was there? There were 7,000 SS personnel at Auschwitz. And I think something ludicrous, like 4% were ever brought to trial, and even fewer were convicted. Because you couldn't say, you obviously, there are some famous monsters that people talked about, like Mengele, and these people become the figureheads for it all, and they try and find them. He died of a heart attack swimming in Brazil or somewhere, and they found him because of his dental records, something like that. They had many, many opportunities to find him, and there was an apathy towards it all. And let's face it, in Germany, a monster like Kurt Franz, Lalka, at Treblinka. Oh, those poor people. And he's interviewed in prison. And you see it, it's on YouTube. And this is a monster. Many, many people bore witness to what he'd done, how horrific. He trained his dog, a St. Bernard called Barry, to attack the genitals of the victims. And he'd go, man, get that dog, a very strange expression. And the dog would go and rip prisoners apart. This is a very interesting fact. When the dog was away from France, he was docile, children could pat him. But with France, he turned into a monster. That's a very good allegory for all this.
Yes.
So then he's in prison, and then he says, oh, my wife is not well. She's very ill. So they let him out. The last 10 years of his life, he'd murdered hundreds of people by himself, at his own hands. I'm not talking about it, also his responsibility for 1.2 million being gassed, which he is responsible for. But, yes, very difficult to apply the law just so arbitrarily. They wasted time, and that was their guilt. They couldn't cope with it. There was, in Shoah, there's an extraordinary scene. He goes, how many steins of beer do you pour? And he said, I'd rather not be filmed. I'd rather not be filmed. But he's this man, just pouring pints of beer. He looks, to my mind, thoroughly malevolent. He really does. And he's going, no, please, I have my reasons. Please don't film me. He says, answer him. Well, I do this amount, And he says, I can't remember his name. But you were at Beljet's, weren't you? Do you remember this man? Christian Wirth. This horrible, evil man just going about his daily life, free. It shocked me. It absolutely shocked me. Yeah. It's leniency, an inability. Oh, well, that's the past. Let's leave the past in the past. And these ordinary men just getting away with it. Extraordinary.
It's an interesting point, though, isn't it? That is I know exactly what you mean when you say you've got someone that's just going about their every day as you and I would, but the wicked of the world are not cutting heads off 24/7. They are in the crudest of ways of saying it, normal people.
Yes.
They will live carry out a similar existence to that of you and I.
That's true, but can you imagine a people that enacted that? I don't know a greater evil in human history than that. I really don't.
I think this is a interesting way that we can segue into what I think will take some interesting turns. What defines evil?
Lack of humility.
In what sense?
Well, in the sense of lack of conscience, or even more chilling, believing that what you're doing is necessary and right, which is what they did. But we were talking about 1,000 years of ingrained hatred of the Jews, aren't we? You know.
Well, that's the interesting point, though. Is I would go on the other side of this, and I would say that the normality, or the normalizing rather, is sort of a point against the question of evil, because I look at a group that I don't think this is going to be a particularly controversial snippet if someone takes it. A group of person that I find absolutely detestable, and I would like to consider myself someone who's got quite a good grasp of empathy, but that grasp is totally loose when it comes to Hamas. I cannot understand any emotion besides total hatred towards this group, but through reading I am aware of the fact that a tremendous amount of people who are brought into, say for instance, Al-Qaeda, are indoctrinated at a very young age, and they are brought into these regimes before radicalized, and they don't understand what they're getting into. I mean, there are some particularly malignant threads when it comes to those groups because of the way that the religious interpretations. But I think normalizing or radicalizing or just general indoctrination is a key part of a lot of evil acts, and I think it actually detracts from the evil. I think it quite possibly adds or exacerbates the evil of the person doing the radicalizing, but I think it subtracts from the person who is actually potentially carrying out the acts underneath that person.
Yes. That's a very, very good point, isn't it? Because the person doing the radicalizing never gets his hands dirty.
But but the people with the dirty hands are doing the wicked work in understanding that it's okay. I may well have said this to you, but there was a picture and some Sam Harris wisdom to go alongside it that I thought was very interesting on this point, and it was two ISIS members about to throw someone off of a building.
Quiz for Palestine?
Yeah, quite possibly.
Is that controversial?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I don't understand, but they haven't read much into it.
Yeah, Quiz for Palestine is probably the most...
I don't know anything about them. I wish them very, very best of luck. But you should do some reading.
Yeah, you should read a book.
Because
if you can.
I always thought, somebody said... So I don't think I'm being controversial, that if there was a building left standing in Palestine, they would be taken to the top of it and invited to jump.
Yeah. Oh, well, invited with a
because it is fundamentally against the holy law.
Exactly.
But I do like what my great hero Christopher Hitchens said about that great law. Well, he said, well, let me get this right. The last word of God was given to an illiterate merchant warlord. Don't waste my time. And it was the, he was famous for hitch slaps, they called them. Yeah. That is extraordinary. I suppose his modern, sadly he died. All the atheists said that he was attacked by the organ of his blasphemy. He got esophageal cancer. I think it's more to do with the facts of the boobs. Yeah. But Douglas Murray seems to have his laser-like wit and understanding. And he had, as soon as October 7th happened and the atrocities committed, which were the worst since the Holocaust, of course, although there were pogroms in Poland after the Holocaust. You know about that?
I don't know about that.
Yeah, that's a great sadness. You know, there's people. There's Leon Feldhandler, who was with Sasha Pachevsky, the Soviet prisoner of war at Sobibor, the ringleader of the camp break, and he'd survived and he'd gone back to his town, and he was helping Jewish refugees, and he was murdered by Polish anti-Semites. He'd survived all that. That's we segued again.
Yeah, I'm going to bring it back just to that ISIS example,
yes.
and then I think there's an interesting point we can go through with Douglas Murray and Hitchens. These two ISIS members had their hands on the shoulders of someone with a bag over his head. Now, it doesn't take much for you to put two and two together of where this man was about to go, but the footage of the actual play of it, not just the screenshot, came with audio that clearly shows the two men alongside this victim saying, essentially, words to the effect of, "I'm sorry, brother. I know this is not what you want, but this is what has to happen. You will be redeemed by God." And when I heard that, I thought, that is a totally different spin on
or it's a bit too late to be making enemies.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it's a totally different spin on evil, because as someone, as I say, I think a group that I can sort of outsource all of my hatred towards comes quite well packaged in your ISISes and your Hamases of the world. But seeing that, it really puts me back in touch with the fact that these people genuinely think what they're doing is right. It is not carrying out evil for the sake of evil. And that's where I find evil such an interesting moral question, is if you don't think you're doing something wrong, are you being evil? And Sam Harris has a great book called The Moral Landscape, which speaks on this matter of what constitutes morality, what defines evil, how does free will come into this point. And it's a great question, because you think, we can, from a Western perspective, look and say, there is no world where throwing people off of buildings because they're homosexual or clothing women besides their eyes is an acceptable thing to carry out. But in some parts of the world, this is totally normalised. Now, Sam's point on this is we should have a bearing of essentially the way to understand whether something is right or wrong is the amount of people that are objectively, positively or negatively influenced by it. So we can look and say the more people that die as a result of a rule, the worse that rule is, and vice versa. But I do think evil is a tremendously difficult question to, or sort of emotion to capture, because I think, for instance, I've paid quite a lot of attention to psychopathy because I find psychopathy very interesting. And when you can look at the instances, there's one instance that I will never forget on a book that I read on psychopathy called The Psychopath Test, of someone who was released from...
Did you pass?
Yes. He was released from Borstal, I think. Not Borstal, doesn't matter. And...
Young Offenders Institute.
Yeah, certainly not Borstal. It was a...
Do they have Borstal anymore? Is it?
I don't know.
It's probably one of those words that has been outlawed. Where
was Ronnie Cray put into?
Broadmoor,
that's the one. Broadmoor. Someone was released from Broadmoor on essentially
Jimmy Savile used to go and visit him, didn't he?
Interesting. Yeah, interesting relations. And this guy, they essentially did a test. They'd brought someone in who was working with psychedelics and essentially empathy therapy, and they were trying to see whether you could basically reform a psychopath, which you can't. And when they did this, they sort of temporarily released these people. They gave them more freedom than they would have otherwise been allowed. They were still in the institution, but they had more freedom. with said freedom, one of the targeted or sort of labelled psychopaths took a hatchet to someone and killed him. And when he was asked, why did you do that? He said, well, because I wanted to know what a hatchet did to a person. And I thought that's an exceptional circumstance because of the psychopathy, but that sort of morbid curiosity certainly detracts from evil for me, because I think there's such a lack of understanding there that is so key to that you are fundamentally missing human existence. Essentially, there's something so terribly wrong there.
Making it banal.
Yeah, but unintentionally. You're not. There is no. In many respects, there's no thought to that. It is just curiosity, and I think that's quite a prevalent theme of evil. Is people will carry out things that are wicked and horrendous, and it's not as simple. I don't think there are many people in the world, or potentially even in history, who have the single-minded focus of total destruction with total understanding of that destruction and total enjoyment of that destruction. Those people do unequivocally exist, but I think they are a very, very, very significant minority when it comes to acts of evil across history. I think a lot of it falls in line with
certainly,
that system.
But